Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Unsolved Mysteries thread. I poured out another shot as I waited in the haze of the bar, thick smoke bathing the room like an ever-present specter of death. The patrons there all knew my name, or at least all knew my game. Having shattered more than a few skulls and a few hearts in this city, that's to be expected. What wasn't expected was the dossier my client had left for me. I had seen some pretty ugly things working this job, but nothing quite like this. I checked my Magnum to make sure it was loaded. I swilled the other to make sure that I was loaded. This was going to be a long night, and if I wasn't going to be getting any sleep, I at least needed the sweet sucker of a drink to take my mind off the grind of the cases that lay before me. Where to begin? Cold trails and cold people seemed to be the ticket. That's all that was contained in this stained dossier, so no better place to start than page 1. Case 1. The Death Valley Germans. In the morning of October 21st, 1996, Death Valley National Park, DVNP Ranger Dave Brenner was aboard a military helicopter somewhere in the skies over the southerly part of Death Valley. He was part of a routine aerial surveillance looking for clandestine drug manufacturing labs in the backcountry. Around 11 a.m., he saw something unexpected. A vehicle in the wash of Anvil Canyon, approximately 2.4 miles downstream from Willow Spring, the head of Anvil Canyon. This was extremely odd for several reasons. First, there wasn't a real or legal road down Anvil Canyon any longer. At one time, Anvil Canyon had been the only route into Butte Valley and used by the area's miners. But with the opening of the talc mines in Warm Spring Canyon to the north and the creation of a good, well-graded dirt road to the talc mines for heavy trucks, the Butte Valley miners pushed an extension of the Warm Spring Road westward into Butte Valley, and the Anvil Canyon route relegated to a seldom-used byway. Then, in October of 1994, with the passage of the Desert Protection Act, Anvil Canyon was designated as part of an official wilderness area, thus prohibiting vehicle use in it. Not that the few locals seemed to adhere to the prohibition, as Anvil Canyon still received occasional, if illicit, use. The second piece of oddness in what Brenner was observing was that the vehicle appeared to be a standard passenger van. While Anvil Canyon could still be traveled by a competent four-wheel drive vehicle, if illegally, a passenger van was totally inappropriate and couldn't be expected to get far in that canyon. Yet there it was. Upon landing nearby, Brenner inspected the vehicle. It was a green 1996 Plymouth Voyager van with California license plates. It was covered with considerable dust, as if it had been out there for some time. The van was clearly stuck in the wash, sunk up to its axles in the sand, with its two rear tires flattened and its left front tire also flat. Tracks left in the sand by the van suggested it had been driven at least 200 feet with flat rear tires. The van was locked, with no sign of the owner. Brenner noted the license number and reported it back to the DVNP headquarters. A quick check on the license plate with the California Highway Patrol, CHP, revealed the vehicle was reported stolen by the Los Angeles Police Department on September 10, 1996. The vehicle, owned by Dollar Rent-A-Car, had been rented to a group of 4 German tourists in Los Angeles on July 8, 1996. The vehicle had been due back to the rental agency in Los Angeles on July 26, but had never been returned. It was the rental agency's policy to wait at least 30 days past when a vehicle was due to report it stolen. Checking the names of the renters turned up an August 14th Interpol alert on them. They were Egbert Rimkus, 34, his son Georg Weber, 11, Egbert's girlfriend Cornelia Meyer, 28, and her son Max Meyer, 4. Further investigation showed the group left Frankfurt and arrived in the United States at Seattle on July 8th, then immediately flew to Los Angeles where they picked up their rental van. Because Egbert could not produce his driver's license, Cornelia was recorded as the driver. The van was due back on July 26th, and the group had tickets on Transworld Airlines to return to Germany on July 27th. They were not on that flight, nor was there evidence of them leaving the USA. For the first week or so in the USA, the Germans based themselves in the San Clemente area of Southern California, doing normal tourist things. On July 12th, Egbert made a call to his bank in Dresden requesting $1,500 be wired to a Bank of America branch in San Clemente. The money ended up being sent to a Bank of America branch in Los Angeles. At this point, their travels become a bit vague, but the images on their recovered camera suggest they traveled the California coast a bit, before ending up in Las Vegas and staying at the Treasure Island Hotel. On July 21st, Egbert faxed a request from the hotel to his ex-wife and son's mother, Heike Weber, requesting additional funds be sent to him. These funds were never sent. The party checked out of the Treasure Island Hotel on July 22nd and proceeded to Death Valley. Receipt records at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center show that on July 22nd, 2 copies of the booklet, Death Valley National Monument Museum text in the German language were sold. None were sold on July 23rd. A copy of this booklet was found in the abandoned van, which places the group at the DV Visitor Center sometime on July 22nd. Meanwhile, back at the van in Anvil Canyon, an investigation and search was beginning in earnest. On October 22nd, the day after the van's discovery, around 10 a.m., DVNP investigator Eric Inman was flown in via CHP helicopter to the site. He performed an initial search and photographed the location. Other than Dave Brenner's tracks from the previous day, no other footprints were visible. Some food wrappers were found near the van, as well as some fecal material and toilet paper, cat holes. At 11 a.m., Inman returned via the CHP helicopter to Badwater Road in Death Valley, where he met with representatives of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, Detective Jim Jones and Corporal Leon Boyer. Following discussion, the Inyo Sheriff's personnel proceeded to the van's location via vehicle, and Inman was flown back in around 1 p.m. With Sheriff's personnel present, Inman opened the van's doors, and an examination of its contents began. While there were many items of interest, of particular note was an American flag labeled Butte Valley Stone Cabin. This cabin, also known as the Geologist's Cabin, is located in Butte Valley 4.1 miles westerly from the van's location in Anvil Canyon. This cabin is a comfortable shelter, somewhat stocked with food, with a good source of water adjacent to it, Anvil Spring. The flag had apparently been taken from the cabin and indicated the party had been to the cabin at some point. Some other items of note found in the van: 2 unopened bottles of beer, Bud Ice, and 1 empty bottle, 1 empty and 1 3/4 full bottle of bourbon, several empty large water and juice containers, luggage and clothing, numerous exposed rolls of 35mm film and a Praktica 35mm camera, 1 new Coleman sleeping bag in its box, and 1 empty Coleman sleeping bag box, a tent, a pipe with tobacco, a leather card carrier containing Swiss bank cards and a Citicorp card for Egbert, card from the Seahorse Resort in San Clemente, numerous toys, an unused compact spare tire and jack. Under the direction of the Inyo Sheriff's Office, the van was removed from Anvil Canyon on October 23rd at about 2 p.m. by Miller's Towing of Lone Pine and stored at their impound lot. Back at park headquarters, a review of visitor logbooks routinely collected by field rangers turned up a valuable clue. The visitor logbook for the Warm Spring mine site, located on the route between the Main Valley and Butte Valley, had an apparent entry by the group. Although difficult to read, on July 23rd, it states in German, "We are going over the pass," and was signed Connie, Egbert, Georg, Max. The pass referred to in the logbook entry was almost certainly Mengel Pass, located a few miles from Anvil Canyon at the southwesterly end of Butte Valley, and the only means by which to cross the Panamint mountain range for many miles. However, it is an extremely rugged route, traversable by only the most competent 4WD vehicle and driver. It would be impassable for a vehicle such as the Germans were driving. Further investigation showed that the party had not stayed at the Furnace Creek Ranch or Inn, the Stovepipe Wells Resort, nor had registered at the Furnace Creek Campground. Their whereabouts between being at the DVNP Visitor Center on July 22nd and signing the Warm Spring logbook on July 23rd were unknown at the time. On October 23rd at 10 a.m., the first searchers were in place. They included the China Lake Mountain Rescue Group, CLMRG, 9 trackers from the Indian Wells Valley Search and Rescue Group, and 8 mounted units from the Kern County Sheriff's Mounted Search and Rescue. On this day, members of the CLMRG found a Bud Ice beer bottle planted in the sand in Anvil Canyon, adjacent to a bush approximately 1.7 miles downstream, easterly, from the van's location. The bottle matched those found in the van. It appeared a ledge had been brushed clear of rocks, and someone left a large seat print next to the bottle. The placement of the sitting spot, on the easterly side of the bush, suggested it was to shade from a late afternoon sun. This clue was to be the first and last found in the initial search. The area searched this day covered much of Anvil Canyon from the van easterly to its mouth at the Warm Spring Road. Day 2 of the search, October 24th, brought additional teams and expanded the search area. In addition to CLMRG, Indian Wells, and the Kern County mounted teams already on site, SAR search and rescue teams arrived from Nye County, Nevada, and Inyo County. Areas searched this day included more of Anvil Canyon, portions of Warm Spring Road and Butte Valley, Mengla Pass, the area adjacent to Warm Spring Road between the canyon mouth and West Side Road, and from the van location easterly to the head of Anvil Canyon at Willow Spring. There were also 2 helicopters involved that day, both for searching and shuttling supplies and searchers. Day 3 of the search, October 25th, expanded it even further. A team from DVNP searched the area between the mouth of Anvil Canyon and the far side of the main valley at Badwater Road. A SAR team from Victorville searched the southeastern perimeters of Butte Valley. A Bureau of Land Management ranger began a search of the route on the west side of Mengla Pass, between Ballarat and Barker Ranch. A team from Lake Mead NP searched from Anvil Canyon northerly, over the mountains and down into Butte Valley. The Indian Wells team did an intensive search around Willow Spring at the head of Anvil Canyon. CLMRG started from the middle of Anvil Canyon, then went north, then westerly. The same 2 helicopters were still at work shuttling supplies and searchers, as well as searching. The 4th day of the search, October 26th, was the final day. The DVMP team checked areas northerly of Warm Spring Canyon as well as mine areas a lost person might have sought shelter in. The Victorville team performed searches around Stripe Butte and Butte Valley. The Lake Mead team also checked Stripe Butte, as well as walking the Warm Spring Canyon Road. The Bureau of Land Management ranger on the west side of Mengla Pass continued searching that area, as well as other possible routes the party may have used if traveling westerly towards Ballarat. The Indian Wells team searched the vicinity of Warm Spring Road and West Side Road when some footprints had been found. A vehicle SAR team from Apple Valley, new to the search, searched areas along West Side Road from Warm Spring Canyon Road northerly, where a party may have sought shelter. Finally, aerial reconnaissance was made via 2 helicopters in all quadrants surrounding Anvil Canyon, including south, but was hampered by high winds. At the end of the day, with no new clues found since the beer bottle on the first day, and no hope whatsoever that the party would be found alive, the search was called off. This was truly a massive search performed by very competent search teams. The CLMRG people alone are some of the best in this part of the country. There were over 45 searchers in the field, and 2 helicopters in the air at any given time, and 8 horses on the ground. Costs for the search were approximately $80,000 in 1996 dollars. It was estimated by a DVNP spokesperson that 250 people were involved in the search at one time or another. The areas searched were well reasoned, and a high probability of success was expected. Unfortunately, even a high probability is not a guarantee. In the years since 1996, numerous additional searches were made, some by search and rescue teams, some by private groups. CLMRG in particular made a number of trips back to search additional areas and examine mine shafts. Searches by private groups tended to be more informal and less is known of them. 2 of the more prominent individuals in this area include Dick Hasselman, a retired professor at Virginia Tech, and Emmett Harder, who had prospected in the Butte Valley area for many years. Both had conducted at least several searches in the area and wrote reports of their findings. Aside from these occasional searches, things remained calm and peaceful in Anvil Canyon. During his involvement with this incident, Emmett Harder had been granted access by the Inyo Sheriff's Office to view the pictures recovered from the Germans' camera. Due to his familiarity with the area, he recognized a sunset picture, looking easterly down into the main valley as having been taken in Hanaupa Canyon, located about 17 miles northerly of Warm Spring Canyon. Given the presence of the Germans at the DV Visitors Center on July 22nd and their Warm Spring logbook entry of July 23rd, this suggests the Germans made camp in the upper reaches of Hanaupa Canyon the night of July 22nd. A couple of environmental conditions at the time of the incident are worth mentioning. Death Valley in summer can be a formidable experience, especially backcountry travel. Even experienced desert travelers with well-equipped vehicles may give second thought to such an idea. I first came across the story of the missing Germans sometime in the summer of 2008. While romping around the interwebs between piano-playing cats and oceans of porn, I saw references to the tale on a Death Valley forum. It sounded interesting, so I Googled a bit more and came across a report the CLMRG had done for their newsletter, The Talus Pile. The newsletter item laid out the basics of the case, but not much more. I was intrigued, but was quickly diverted by more piano-playing cats. Still, it remained in the back of my mind, and was one of the two cases that got me seriously interested in the search and rescue field. The other was Steve Fawcett. After joining the Riverside Mountain Rescue Unit, RMRU, in February of 2009, I actively began seeking out whatever training I could find. One opportunity I came across was a 2-1-2-day course on man tracking in Ridgecrest at the end of September 2009. I know man tracking sounds a bit ominous, but it just involves learning to follow the tracks of people rather than animals. That skill comes in handy in SAR operations. The class was being hosted by the CLMRG, and I knew a lot of their members would be in attendance. This was a great opportunity to ask more about the Germans' case. I had now been in SR long enough to know that there are often details to incidents that don't make it into general circulation, and many times there is much more to the story. The missing German struck me as a case that simply had to have more to it. After making an inquiry or two, I was told, "Oh, you need to talk to Debbie Breitenstein. She's obsessed with it. She was on the original search and has all the background." In my world, obsessed is good, so this looked promising. Due to class activities, I wasn't able to connect with Debbie until almost the end of the class, which was at a barbecue held at her home. Ever suave with opening lines, I think I started with something to the effect of, "So tell me about the missing Death Valley Germans." Debbie at first appeared a little reluctant to get into the subject, as if she didn't want to dump an avalanche of information on me. But my obnoxious persistence and the thought that someone else actually was interested in the topic finally got her going. Beyond getting a much more detailed rundown of the incident, I found out two major points of information. The first was that Debbie had much of the original documentation of the search in her possession. The second was that, unlike many cases, there really wasn't more to it than met the eye. The basic information of the case I was already aware of was all there really was. This only added to the mystery. Debbie also mentioned the names of two private individuals who had performed some searching and written reports of their efforts, Emmett Harder and Dick Hasselman. She said she thought their reports might still be available online. Returning home, I swung into data collection mode. Ignoring my usual diversions of lolcats, I scoured the internet for even the slightest mention of the Germans, as well as the Harder and Hasselman reports. I was able to find a few bits, but the two reports I was after eluded me. Seeing Dick Hasselman being referred to as a retired professor from Virginia Tech, I was able to track down his university email and send him a query. After a bit of back and forth, he sent me a hard copy of his latest version. In terms of factual events, it displayed the accuracy typically seen in academic work, which was refreshing, and he had also spent considerable time interviewing the relatives of the Germans back in Germany, attempting to develop a profile of the group. This, however, left me a bit uneasy. It's well known in the SR field that relatives are notoriously poor in describing even such simple things as what a subject was wearing when last seen. To ask them to describe a subject's state of mind or intent years after an event is just asking to be led down wrong paths. So while I found much of his work spot on, my experience caused me to weigh the data points differently and ultimately found many of his conclusions improbable. Hasselman did bring up a couple of possible new clues I had not been aware of. First, there was a story of an individual on an ATV finding a couple of German canteens in an area described as being the midpoint of a straight line drawn between Sugarloaf and Needle Peak. This would have been about 3.5 miles southeasterly of the van's location. As riding an ATV off-road in a national park was not something authorities smiled upon, getting details of this alleged event was difficult. The second possible clue mentioned, in the 3-month period between when the Germans apparently became stuck and when the van was discovered, a ranger on patrol about 18 miles to the south found an abandoned sleeping bag in the middle of a remote dirt road. As there was a sleeping bag from the van unaccounted for, could this possibly be connected? Unfortunately, not yet aware of the Germans who were at that time missing in Anvil Canyon, DVNP disposed of the sleeping bag as trash, so it could never be examined as evidence. I found this second clue very intriguing due to a personal connection. Oddly, my wife Jerry and I had done a hiking trip in the very area where the sleeping bag was found in March of 1996, only 4 months before the Germans became trapped. The road where the bag was found is rugged and extremely remote, ending at a microwave relay tower at time owned by AT&T. I knew the road and I knew the tower and thought it could have been a landmark a lost person might move toward. I also knew there was nothing much else to be seen in the area, as it's against the northerly edges of the China Lake Naval Weapons Center boundary, and covering a straight line distance of 18 miles in the heat of July seemed highly unlikely. Tracking down Emmett Harder's report eventually led me to a visit to his home in Devore, California, on October 21st. We spoke for almost 4 hours about the case, the people involved, and the general area of Death Valley. He also provided me with a copy of his report, Cauldron of Hellfire, as well as a copy of the DV investigator's report by Eric Inman, and several other useful documents. I asked him about the German canteens that Hasselman said were supposedly found to the south, between Sugarloaf and Needle Peaks. Harder had some detail on this, as well as knowing and talking to the motorcyclist who supposedly found them. But he didn't put too much weight on it, as the individual was unable to actually produce the canteens, and the responses were less than satisfactory in Harder's opinion. Further, Harder later found out there was a food and water cache placed in the same general area for a group of long-distance hikers and survivalists traveling from Battle Mountain, Nevada to the Salton Sea. The party ended up missing their cache, and so it would have remained in place, and any canteens could be related to that. During all this, I continued to pester Debbie for more information, and despite her work commitments, she obliged, and more data kept flowing my way. Incident logs, clue lists, all sorts of wonderful stuff. In reviewing it, I was impressed with the quality and thoroughness of the previous searching done by the various search and rescue teams. It became obvious to me that there were certain areas that, looking back in hindsight, could probably be excluded as they had been rigorously searched. Amazingly, this could be said of all of Anvil Canyon, most of Butte Valley, as well as Warm Spring Canyon. In essence, every place the Germans should have gone had been thoroughly searched with no trace found. This was certainly a strange case. Yet 4 people can't simply vanish into thin, if somewhat hot, air. This is probably the reason so many wild ideas as to their fate appeared over the years. The vacuum of solid information was slowly filled with wild speculation. Perhaps now might be a good time to list some of the ideas out there and editorialize a bit. Probably the most popular explanation as to what became of the Germans is that they staged the incident to disappear and start new lives. This was given some momentum by Egbert's ex-wife saying there were custody issues with their son. Also, co-workers of Egbert's stated he talked about moving to Costa Rica, which was rumored to have provided some sort of legal shelter if he brought his son along. As I said, this was a popular scenario. Even some search and rescue members and DVNP staff thought it possible. But really, if you wanted to stage a disappearance, why do it in a dangerous and remote environment like Death Valley in summer? It could have been just as effective and much simpler to have done such a thing while in Las Vegas. Further, Cornelia had a thriving business back in Germany, which required her attention upon her return. She was in no position to vanish. Another idea floating around was that Egbert was intent on penetrating the China Lake Naval Weapons Station facility in the hopes of seeing exotic technology. There were a lot of vague, long-after-the-fact reports from relatives that he had heard of a very secret facility near Death Valley and was obsessed with finding out more. Further, he supposedly had some involvement in hybrid propulsion, whatever that means, and variants of this scenario either had the group forcibly conscripted into a black U.S. government program, or more sinisterly, they saw something they weren't supposed to see and were eliminated by U.S. government black world operatives. I suppose my background gives me the advantage of easily seeing the level of nonsense in this theory. I was quite involved in the amazing social fad in the mid-1990s that swirled around the facility at Groom Lake, better known as Area 51. I knew all the major players and spent considerable time unraveling many of its mysteries. Given that era in time, I am certain any reference to a secret facility near Death Valley, especially by a European, was a reference to Area 51 and not China Lake. No offense to China Lake, as I'm sure they have some rather interesting and overlooked things of their own, but there was nothing there to pull in tourists from Germany, and certainly nothing to be inadvertently observed that would make someone disappear. Further, my background also includes graduate work and research in what could best be labeled exotic propulsion, including a few papers. So when someone starts tossing around phrases like hybrid propulsion, I'm qualified to weigh in. First, the phrase itself means nothing, but it suggests something exotic and otherworldly, which was probably the intent. But a Toyota Prius uses hybrid propulsion. Very cool, but nothing amazing. Further, investigating some of the names that Egbert was alleged to have worked with showed them to be designers of exotically styled automotive vehicles. Finally, if someone wanted to see into the China Lake facility and attempt to observe what's going on, there are far better and easier locations to do so. So the idea that the Germans were in that area at all to penetrate or observe the China Lake facility is fantasy. The last of the popular alternative theories as to what befell the Germans involved their crossing paths with some sort of criminal element. Some thought it could have been aging Charles Manson followers from the somewhat nearby Barker Ranch, or merely backcountry sociopaths. I have to admit, there is a possibility of this, but fortunately a very low one. The overwhelming majority of people who have made the effort to get into the backcountry are wonderful folks. This concept has the Germans crossing paths with one or more unsavory individuals, being killed, and their van dumped in Anvil Canyon to hide the crime. The question one must immediately ask is why. Egbert's bank cards were left in the van and not taken. No activity was ever recorded on Cornelia's cards. The van was left locked and no other vehicle tracks were seen. Why wasn't the van taken? It would have been the most valuable thing the Germans had. And then there was the empty beer bottle found well downstream from the van's location. The searchers did spend a lot of time looking for something that could have been a grave but failed. Finally, while bad guys might not be the swiftest people in the world, why would they be hanging around the backcountry of Death Valley in summer? Of course, there were also the even stranger ideas like alien abduction. When people seemingly vanish into thin air, everybody jumps to blame the aliens. It appears to be the explanation of last resort and useful in almost any situation, but without going too far out on a limb, I think we can safely eliminate the possibility in this case. Given the lack of clues in this case, after time it became sort of a Rorschach test for searchers. People saw what they wanted to see as their minds attempted to form a conclusion. It's well known that the human mind desperately wants to connect cause and effect and will often craft answers when there are, in fact, none. I had now reached the point where I possessed all the information I was likely to obtain for the case. I had also spent many hours studying topo maps and Google Earth. I was beginning to seriously look at the area southerly of the van, primarily because it seemed to be the only area that hadn't been searched and the terrain didn't seem impassable. Problem was, there was no apparent reason for the party to head in that direction. The found beer bottle suggested they were heading eastward, toward the main valley. It was now time to head into the field and observe what things looked like for myself and see if there was any conceivable reason the Germans might want to have headed south. I decided on the perhaps not too bright course of action of making this a solo trip. I thought it important that I see the area with fresh eyes, undistracted by company. My plan was to hike into Anvil Canyon, and perhaps linger in the canyon until after dark, coming out via headlamp and camping in my truck at the trailhead. I thought this could be useful as the moon's phase and rise set times were similar to what was in effect when the Germans were there. I was interested to observe if there were any distant sky glows visible that could have enticed them into a specific direction, especially to the south. On Tuesday, October 27th, I managed to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m., more asleep than awake. After the obligatory stop in beautiful Baker for gas and what passes for fine dining at a mini-mart, I made it to the head of Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. A couple of things struck me about the trip in. First, I was surprised at how long it took to get from the pavement of Badwater Road into Butte Valley. It was about 1.5 stinking hours with no stopping or sightseeing. Second, I was also impressed by how bad the road becomes at places after passing Warm Spring. These sort of observations were precisely the reason I wanted to do this first trip alone. I wanted to look at this all as someone who has never seen it before, as the Germans had, and note what feelings and impressions I got. And the underlying impression was that this was one very remote place, and I hadn't even left the truck yet. I started off from the truck and down Anvil Canyon about 10 a.m. It was very windy and pretty cool, maybe 60 degrees. As I left the trail head at Willow Spring, I noted there is no obvious way to know if there's really water present, unless you go down and rummage through the brush. To a casual observer, it just looks like a dense brush. On the way to the van's location, another observation, I was really amazed at how much burrow tracks look like human sneaker footprints. I could see how someone not knowing what they were could mistake them for fresh human tracks and maybe follow them. It appeared as if there was a deranged running club going up and down Anvil Canyon. Oh yeah, and I was struck by how sandy and loose the material was that comprised the road in the wash. Very easy to get a vehicle stuck. With the GPS coordinates, I made it to the van's location easily. There was a rock cairn present on the large rock near the left front of the vehicle that came to rest. I marked off the approximate outline of the van with flags and took photos to match those in the Death Valley National Park investigators' report. It was pretty obvious how they took a right fork when the road, such as it was, actually veered left and ended up in no man's land. As I climbed up on the bank of the wash to the south to take overall pictures, it suddenly struck me that Egbert probably did the same thing and was at the same spot on the bank to get an overview of where they were. It was a very eerie feeling. I continued onto the bottle site, coming across some old bones. They looked a bit large to be human, and I'd guess burrow. I took pictures and coordinates. Finding the bottle bush was a little tricky. The coordinates I had from Debbie were rounded a bit, but close. I had printed out the 2 poor black and white prints I had of the location, and was able to line up the background hills for a good match. There was only about a 100-foot area along the wash where the topography lined up. If I had better prints, it would have been easy to find the absolutely precise spot, but I was close enough. I did find what I thought to be the bottle bush, although the ground in front of it looked like it had been eroded a bit by flooding in the intervening years. I sat there a while and thought about where I was, what I was seeing, and took some panoramas of the view. The seating location obviously suggests shading from very late afternoon sun. Early in the day it would have been in direct sun, so I think that puts a general time of day on when it was used. At this point the wind had picked up much more, and the weather was getting colder and weirder. The main valley was dusty enough that I could not see past the mouth of Anvil Canyon in the distance, or to the other side of the main valley. There was a real milky-looking overcast that left me with an ominous feeling. Looking at the time, I was thinking I wouldn't be able to make it southerly past Squaw Spring, as I would have liked, and still make it back to my truck by 5. I had already decided I didn't want to be out hiking in Anvil Canyon after dark, as there wouldn't be much of a moon with the overcast. Also, being there solo, the history of the place and the weather was all making things more than a bit creepy for me. I decided I had time to poke a bit more down Anvil Canyon, then up to Squaw Spring. My maps showed an old road that ran from Anvil Canyon southwest up to Squaw Spring. As I traveled easterly down Anvil Canyon, I was looking for anything that might have enticed the Germans to head south. For most of the route, that way was blocked by mountains, but near the bottle bush, the topography to the south opened up, and I knew that Squaw Spring was up there somewhere. Having seen the burrow tracks, I was assembling a marvelous scenario in my mind where the Germans had also seen them and been led astray. My brilliant theory was that when they got to the bend in the road shown on my map that turns back to the right and heads southwesterly up to Squaw Spring, they may have seen burrow tracks heading up the road to the spring and, thinking they were human, followed them to the south. Of course, I knew that CLMRG had returned to the area on a later search and thoroughly explored the Squaw Spring area without luck. But I put that thought aside and was quite proud of my idea. Sadly, that idea was dashed when I reached the road bend. I use the term road in the loosest sense. The road up to the right was so faded it was almost invisible. I had it shown on my GPS map, which saved me, and it was so rocky it couldn't possibly have shown burrow tracks. Nevertheless, I started up the road, climbing the alluvial fan toward Squaw Spring. Looking south, at this point I couldn't think of any conceivable reason they would have been drawn in that direction. While the terrain to the south looked milder, there was no obvious attraction to proceed that way. As I reached the ridge opposite Squaw Spring, an incongruous clump of green on the hillside, it was almost 3 p.m. and time to get the hell out of Dodge, so I really didn't get to poke in the shrubs at all. But as with Willow Spring, this was a case of not seeing obvious water. Now the road to Squaw Spring makes almost a 180 bend, so you end up going east down Anvil Canyon a ways, then backtrack up to Squaw Spring. To save distance and get out of this crazy place as quickly as possible, I decided to save time and just head cross-country almost straight back to the van, cutting off maybe 1 or 1.5 miles and lots of walking in sand. It was an adventure, going up and down through ravines, and I saw some interesting stuff I wouldn't have otherwise seen. I came across a nice .50 caliber shell casing from 1943, a sure sign that I'm in an out-of-the-way place. I've found a great many of those out in the desert. By now the wind was howling, not quite yet bad enough for goggles, and the temperature had dropped to the mid-50s. I got back to the truck about 4:40 p.m. after covering a total of just over 12 miles for the day. As there was still light for about another hour, I decided I'd just try for home rather than spend a night with the truck rocking in the wind, not to mention being a little relieved to return to civilization and away from this god-awful place. I managed to get home just after 10 p.m., more than a little tired. 10 hours driving and almost 7 hours hiking. Sadly, I've done stupider things and I would yet do worse. So having seen the spots and soaking up the ambiance, I began dwelling on the problem, trying to come up with a scenario that reasonably fit what was known about the case and, as a bonus, might just make some sense. On October 29th, only 2 days after my hike, I was at home looking at an overall map of Death Valley. Like viewing one of those optical illusions where an image suddenly pops out, everything just fell into place and became visible. I suddenly saw a way the Germans could have ended up in Anvil Canyon through a series of reasonable, honest mistakes, and why they might have set out for the south. I was also acutely aware that I might have done exactly the same thing were I in their situation. Is this in fact what happened? No one can know for sure. But it offered an explanation for their apparent actions and fits the known facts of the incident very well. The final page of the dossier ended abruptly, like words of a dying man. I was left craving more, but the descriptions ended there, the story vanishing like the subjects of it. I remembered the parting words of my client. Good things come to those who wait, and I took this to mean the story was not yet finished. I would have to wait, another day perhaps, and my patience could be rewarded with the missing pieces of the puzzle. For the night, however, I decided to turn in.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.